Swoop Airlines under fire this morning after passengers of a canceled flight from Kelowna to Winnipeg were told they'd have to wait up to 11 days for a new flight. Air passenger rights advocate Gabor Lukacs is joining us now with more. So, Gabor, what can passengers do in this situation?
Good morning, Sonia. Passengers in this situation are entitled to transportation on flights of other airlines. Swoop cannot just insist to transport them on its own flights if they don't have planes, if they don't have seats available. So what should have already happened is that passengers should have been rebooked on WestJet or Air Canada. If Swoop fails to comply with that obligation, then passengers should buy tickets on their own and then seek compensation for their losses for meals, hotels, the extra airfare, parking, lost wages, and additional punitive damages from Swoop. What Swoop is doing in this case is clearly wrong. It's an egregious wrong. It's not simply a mistake. It's a complete disregard of the passengers' rights.
And from your understanding, why would a situation like this arise?
That is something I would love to hear from Swoop. We all see and understand that sometimes the aircraft breaks down, but that shouldn't mean that passengers cannot travel for 11 days. That situation is either completely wrong planning or just a complete disregard of the passengers' interests. I fear and suspect it's both.
Now, you mentioned that passengers should book on another airline and get reimbursed by Swoop. But in the bigger picture, what kind of rights do passengers have in these types of situations?
In these kind of situations, passengers' rights are governed by the terms and conditions of the airline. And that is why I was referring to, in case of Swoop, they have an obligation explicitly spelled out on page 60 of their terms and conditions in Rule 90 sub C sub 2 sub small c that requires Swoop to rebook passengers on flights of other airlines.
All right. Now, I know that you've been a vocal critic of the federal government stepping in to protect passengers. What do you think they should do or could do in situations like this to better protect people who are flying and have their flights canceled?
What the government should do in this situation is to issue hefty fines to Swoop. This is not a case where maybe the airline did something wrong. It's blatantly clear that they are breaking the rules. They are breaking their own tariff. So there are avenues to step in, to issue fines, to launch an investigation, and to hold the airline accountable for it. Unfortunately, the government has no appetite for that.
Now, how would this situation be held in other countries? I mean, how do our rules here in Canada compare to other nations?
In Europe, it would be a very simple thing. First of all, the passengers would be entitled to probably 400 euros compensation per passenger, because a maintenance issue in Europe is something that the airline is liable for. The airline cannot just walk away from its obligation to passengers because the aircraft breaks down. In Europe, they also have the obligation to rebook passengers on the next available flight, and that is not restricted to their own flights or their own aircraft. So passengers would be, at least in theory, on their way. In Europe, also, sometimes you have to take steps to enforce your rights, but at least the rights as written, as the laws are concerned, are good. In Canada, unfortunately, this is not the case. Under the new rules passed by the government, which will come into force on December 15th, when the airline claims that the delay or cancellation was due to maintenance issues, passengers will have very few rights compared to their European counterparts.
All right, that is air passenger rights advocate Gabor Lukacs joining us via Skype today. Thanks very much for your insight.
Thank you very much for having me.